Well, hi, welcome to Get Centered, where all the clinicians, or most of the clinicians at least, of the Center for the Healing Arts and Sciences come together and talk about topics that are connected with a theme. So we're now circling around various themes related to the seasons. And today's theme, considering this is smack in the middle of summer in July, we're going to talk, or I'm going to talk about heat and hell and an alchemical stage called the calcinatio. In this first slide, I want to begin with a quote by Marie-Louise von Franz. And she says, "The secret has to do with the relation of the unconscious psyche to inorganic matter and to the unitary reality which may be surmised as being their common substrate, that the unus mundus is what we're really talking about." So essentially, early alchemists, and one of the things that Jung was doing was looking at the ways in which matter was a repository for our projections. We were able to, what early alchemists were really doing is working with matter and essentially trying to create this pure substance or gold or universal medicine. And what they didn't realize, and this is Jung's quote, is that they were projecting unconscious aspects of themselves onto matter as they were working with metals. And when you work with various material, you get a sense for what happens when you add heat, what happens when you add water, what happens when you let it sit for a long time. And in this recipe in the laboratory, in their attempt to create gold, whether that's psychological or literal gold, they were unaware of, they're looking at their own souls. And so Jung really looked at alchemy as an opportunity to ground his theory of the unconscious in a material, in matter. So this second slide is an image of the universe, of opposites coming together in a unified whole. And that was essentially the goal. This is from Edinger. His book is Anatomy of the Psyche, Alchemical Symbolism in Psychotherapy, wherein he articulates all these differences in alchemical phases. He says, the real nature of matter was unknown to the alchemist. He knew it only in hints. Inasmuch as he tried to explore it, he projected the unconscious into the darkness of matter in order to illuminate it. While working on his chemical experiments, the operator had certain psychic experiences which appeared to him as the particular behavior of the chemical process. He experienced his projections as a property of matter, but what he was experiencing was his own unconscious. The alchemical phase began with the prima materia, where all of the aspects of material matter and consciousness were interwoven together. It's imagined to be a feminine element, and this image, of course, gets to that. There's a fructifying breast milk that's filling the ocean, and it's this kind of reciprocal process. And this is again from Jung. Materia prima in its feminine aspect. It is the moon, the mother of all things, the vessel. It consists of opposites, has 1,000 names, as mater alchemia. It is wisdom and teaches wisdom. It contains the elixir of life in potentia and is the mother of the Savior and of all the filius macrocosmi. It is the earth and the serpent hidden in the earth, the blackness and the dew, and the miraculous water which brings together all that is divided. She is that piece of chaos which is everywhere and yet hidden. She is that vessel of contradictions and many colors, a totality in the form of massa confusa, yet a substance endowed with every quality in which the splendor of the hidden deity can be revealed. The process, the alchemical process, is one that begins to separate and differentiate the essences of this chaotic prima materia in search of the aqua vita, or the gold. So now to slide 4, this is an image taken from about 16th century of an early alchemist. And what you can see is the lion eating the serpent and an alchemist heating the vessel, and the sun and the moon in the background. And if you look closely, you see a lot of different alchemical symbols that are very important and potent. And if you've ever looked at any alchemical texts, you'll see a lot of really weird images. Here's one of them. This is a book that I'm quite fond of called Alchemy and Mysticism. And you can look through these images and find a lot of very fascinating coded image. Alchemy was not something that you could do. You were put to death if you were experimenting with this, and so people had to keep it hidden. So they spoke in these codes. And in this image in particular, you can see the lion, and the alchemist who is tending to the flame. The lion is oftentimes imagined to be the fire. There's a connection between the sun, fire, and lion. And when you see a fire, the lion, excuse me, when the lion is devouring the snake, you see there's something that's the lion is being nurtured by this chthonic earthly serpent. And of course, I don't have to go into the serpent. There's a lot of symbolism with the serpent, and what that's trying to get at is that when the fire begins to take over the earthly substance, it transforms it into something different and something usable and something that wasn't there before. Now, the essence of this really is that's I think was so brilliant about what Jung was doing is looking at the healing arts, and in particular psychotherapy, how alchemy can be a part of a method. We can look at what happened with material to look at what happens with the material and contents of the psyche in a psychotherapeutic container, and to heat things up. Of course, we all know what that feels like. We even speak about heat in our chest, or heat in our face, or heat in our hands when we have a lot of strong affect and strong emotion. And essentially, somebody comes into psychotherapy, and one of the things that I begin to tell them is just don't edit. Don't edit. If you are pissed off at somebody that cut you off in your car ride on the way over here, or if you're scared about revealing something, bring it out into the container. And that's exposing yourself to the heat, because repression is the alternative to that. And obviously, the heat goes down into the shadow, and it can enact a lot of havoc in somebody's life when we're not conscious of those kinds of expressions. So somebody comes into the psychotherapeutic container, or really any healing container, to allow for the contents of their life experience and their psyche to be exposed to the heat of their own body and of the relationship that's cultivating in the psychotherapeutic dynamic. The purpose is to create a transcendent, miraculous substance, which is variously symbolized as the philosopher's stone, the elixir of life, or the universal medicine. The procedure is first to find the suitable material, the so-called prima materia, and then to subject it to a series of operations that will turn it into the philosopher's stone. And as I was thinking about this, and not the prima materia, but the elixir of life, or the universal medicine, I was taken back to about 100 BC. There was a king named Mithridates who, over time, was exposing himself to poisons, to various poisons, and became immune to it. And in his pursuit, what he ended up doing, because poisons were rampant in antiquity, what he was doing is trying to get a universal antidote. And he was known to be one of the first toxicologists working with the biological corollary to what we're talking about in the psychotherapeutic context. So that's a little more of a concrete way of biologically working with some of these materials and substances. In this slide, what you'll see is the fiery wolf, is the fierce gray wolf, and it's the alchemical image of the wolf devouring the body of the king. And when it has been devoured, it's burned. It burned by the fire. So essentially, this image here is looking at the king, and the king is typically an image for the ego, that this kind of beast, the wolf, the greed, the desirous wolf consumes the king. And then in the background, you see the wolf being burned by the fire. And it's a weird image because the king is doing the burning. And so what it's talking about is allowing yourself to be consumed by these lower, more bestial aspects of our own psyche, and then putting it into the flames to allow for transformation. Of course, this is a good image for our psychic reality. I'll show you a couple of images. This is an image that a friend of mine wrote a long paper on. This is a king in a sweatbox. And again, this is an image of the calcionatio, and that ego, the ruler, or the orienting organ of consciousness, needs to be subjected to an enormous amount of heat, and it begins to sweat. And it's the heat that enacts the transformation. You subject the ego, that narrative of who we are, to enough heat, and all of a sudden the personality begins to shift, because we spend a lot of our time defending ourselves. And this last image, I think this is a deeply important image. It brings in a theological aspect of what we're talking about. And I'm going to read from Edinger, and then I'll open it up for everybody. This is Origen. Origen was a theologian. He says, consider the effects of those faults of passion which often occur in men, as when the soul is burned up with the flames of love, or tormented by the fires of jealousy or envy, or tossed about with furious anger, or consumed with intense sadness, remembering how some men, finding the excess of these ills too heavy to bear, have deemed it more tolerable to submit to death and endure such tortures. And then Edinger amplifies this by saying this is a remarkably psychological interpretation of the fire of hell to have been written in the 3rd century. This is the 3rd century, so this is fascinating. He's not making a theological assertion. He's actually talking about intrapsychic. It demonstrates that for the early church fathers, psychic reality and theological reality were one. Hellfire is the punishment meted out to those who are condemned to the last judgment, who are weighted in the balance and found wanting. So I think when you get into alchemy, the thing that I think is so important is that we can begin to use these material aspects to the processes that we endure in our various therapies or in our various lives. And it contextualizes something in a very different way than we think today. We think jealousy, anger, grief, hatred needs to be avoided and pushed away. And what this is saying is that those emotions need to be brought into our process, and they need to be held, and to know that there is a process that you can enact in order to move through that. Let's chat a bit about that brief descent into alchemy. Any thoughts?
Yeah, I was glad you wrapped up the way that you did, because those images of the consumption that can seem so violent and overtaking,
Yes.
as if one goes away and the other one becomes more powerful, when in reality, what it is an integration.
The most powerful image on that is the Ouroboros, and it's the snake eating its tail. And of course, that can be kind of a negative image when not seen from a deeper symbolic reality, which is there's a self-consumption. So I'm simultaneously consuming myself, but I'm also being nurtured and nourished by myself. So there's this kind of cyclical dynamic. When you see the images, it's powerful. I'll show them to you all in a bit.
From a Jungian point of view, we love talking about all this stuff, but for a lot of people, I think it seems really abstract. I just like to say, in my own work and in work with clients, generally people come in for some sort of idea or a situation or something external that needs to be fixed. And it's more of and they think if they get the right ideas about the thing, and inevitably it comes down to emotion. And I think we in Texas, we know about heat, but I think we also have a recent memory, if we remember sub-freezing temperatures in February when we didn't have any electricity. And we think of those emotions that come into therapy, that come into our lives, as the range between sub-freezing temperatures and burning the house down. And so many, I can see with myself and so many clients, have only the option of sub-freezing temperatures, which are the refusal of emotion and the heat and dissociation from those things, or completely submitting to those things, which would be burning the house down. And finding the right way to work with heat. Heating the house and cooking the food is the necessary middle ground, and that's what we want to find with the way that we work with emotions. And I think what Jung saw is that, we're talking about a time where they don't have the, in a way, artificial divisions that we do of this is spiritual over here, this is psychological over here, this is science over here. It was all of human experience was more connected. And he realized that they were talking about psychological processes and human experiences and our ways of working with emotion. So yeah, I just like to say that in those ideas that seem so abstract, we're really talking about very practical matters of human experience and human development and individual development. And we can associate, when we're talking about heat, we can associate all emotions with heat and how we work with them.
Rodney, it brings up a really good thought about, I use the instrument of consciousness to analyze the instrument of consciousness. And so the having these kind of externalized abstractions to reflect for us what's happening. I mean, when you think about it, how do I, in a two-dimensional space, articulate something? It's like political cartoons. How do I articulate something very complex in a very simple way? And these early, like whether it be Renaissance painters or early, even back into the Egyptian art and hieroglyphs and imagery and symbolism, how do we communicate that? And so back to what you were saying, Leela Scott, is like devouring is a visceral process that we all do all the time. and we have to look at it and contemplate it. And so when I look at the wolf devouring the king, so when you see how do you communicate that, well, the king's not dead, the king actually is in the background, so it's in the foreground is this way and what's in the background is that way. And so that's communicating a complex, there's almost a temporal component to it, like this happens first, that happens later. That first the king has to be devoured, but all of a sudden it's reversed, and now the king is burning the wolf that has devoured himself, and it's paradoxical and it's weird. And what it does, I think, is it pulls us in. It pulls us in to actually query, what is that and what does it mean, and not just take it at face value. And that's kind of what psychotherapy is, or all the healing endeavors that we're involved in, is that we respect it, and we take another look at it. To respect, we take another look at what's presented. And the way that Jim Hollis says it that I love so much is that it's not about what it seems to be about. And what it is about is a compensation for what it really is about. So the image that I like about this is that when I'm on a lake and I see a little bubble pop up, I don't know what's underneath there. I just know there's something underneath there. And that's what psychotherapy does. That's what, I won't speak for you guys, but Chinese medicine and acupuncture, that's what we're all doing, because the patient comes in and says, this is happening to me. Well, if they knew what the thing was, they would have stopped it, right? I mean, we kind of know, like, okay, don't do that anymore. That old joke, like you go into the doctor and say, doc, it hurts when I do this. Well, don't do that. Yeah. Instead, what we say, well, it's not about that. In fact, if this hurts, it could be about this. Or if this hurts, it could be the way I'm doing something in my life that I'm not conscious of. And that's just on a physical level. If we're looking at something emotional or psychological, it's, again, we're using the instrument of our consciousness to look at things that we can't really see. So to me, alchemy is just mind-blowing, and it's pregnant, and it evokes a certain visceral nature that feels like it's energized. And it almost makes me want to go discover more about it. And then it also helps how we can contextualize what's going on with ourselves. I do it all the time. Like when I'm feeling hot in my chest, what's heated? What is it? What's burning up, or what is burning off, or what are my thoughts, or what are the behaviors, or what are my tendencies here? And what needs to be consumed? And if I could say, well, that wolf needs to come and fucking gobble me up, okay, let's see where that takes us.
I guess I'm curious. I have a question more than I have a thought. Is how do you see dreams weaving into this? I guess this is not just a you question, but a Rodney question too.
Totally. Well, let me actually go with Edgar for a second on that, Ariel. I think that's, thank you for asking that. So this is actually about a fire motif, and Edgar talks about Eliade discussing that shaman, a certain shamanic tendency is to tend to fire. And so the shamans were supposed to be immune to fire. They could swallow it or pick it up or burning coals with impunity. And in this connection, a woman had this interesting dream. Here's the dream. The dreamer saw a woman bending over a cauldron-like vat, holding a ball of fire in her hands. With complete nonchalance and no evidence of pain or harm, she held, shaped, and squeezed the ball of fire as though it were a piece of laundry being washed. The dreamer watched with amazement. And he goes on to say, and I'll kind of tee this up to you, Rodney, for a sec. So the dream associated to an ancient Navajo Indian woman that the dreamer once saw making a bread on a heated stone with her bare hands. The dream came at a time when the patient was starting to embark on a major creative project, and indicates that the creative energies of the self were activated, self capital S. The image of invulnerability to fire indicates an immunity to identification with affect. Experience of the archetypal psyche has this effect to the extent that it enlarges and deepens ego consciousness. So you would want to pay attention to elements in the dream. I was interpreting a dream of a patient that had water, and water's a different phase. It's called the solutio. And this patient had something dry in his hands, and the next night had a dream where water was coming out of his ears. And like the dream is answering for something very important. And so we looked at that alchemically as far as what the solutio brings, what's dissolving, what's activated in the psyche. So dreams being the kind of the narrative of the unconscious, or the narrativizing from the unconscious, it can show us in the same way that these images do, what's activated and moving through us. Thank you for being here for Get Centered. We appreciate it and look forward to at some point in the month, we'll have more of these episodes. And be sure to like and subscribe to the page and check out our website at the center4has.com. And thank you all for being here today.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Get Centered for our July seasonal episode. Today, I want to talk about taking a break and what is inside a pause. What is allowed to come to life when we take a break and we take a pause. At the very least, we can think that we might be restored, but at the most, we might think a dream could come to the fore or maybe even come to life. We might have a massive realization. Taking a pause, taking a break is not doing nothing. It tends to be looked at through this lens of laziness or quitting, when in fact, it's a lot that's going on. What we're doing when we take a break is we're being, we're resourcing, we're filling up a cup that is almost empty or maybe has been empty for a very long time. We're tending to the flame of our vitality. We are recharging the almost literal battery of ourselves. And I have heard it said before, I wish I could credit whoever said it, that, gosh, when our electronics are running low on charge, we put them to sleep or we turn them off or we put them on a charger so that they have more juice for the next period of time. And yet we seem to have a really difficult time doing that for ourselves. And what I want to acknowledge is that taking a break, taking a pause is not a luxury, it's a responsibility. It's our responsibility to ourselves and to our collective. When we attempt to offer our resources from a place of not being resourced ourselves, certainly we don't have as much to give. We might even be giving from such an empty place that what we're trying to give is falling flat, despite our best intentions and best efforts. And I feel myself really reflecting on where we were about a year ago now with COVID and quarantine, and with all the caveats aside about how devastating that was for so many and still is for so many. What a forced break and teacher that period of time was. Remember all the creativity that came from that, all the expansiveness. People were being inventive and coming up with, whether it was a new business idea, how are they going to serve their people, their communities, their clients, their patients in a way that they had to just come up with practically on the spot. People engaging with their families in ways that maybe they hadn't in a very long time. And certainly that forced break created a quiet and an openness and a spaciousness that allowed for certain things to come to the surface. And, some people didn't really love that. Uncomfortable stuff was coming up and that felt like torture to them. Other people relished in that, and some people maybe got a little bit of both. But to see today how the traffic is getting to be thicker and thicker, and calendars are getting fuller and fuller, I'm a little concerned that we're going to just walk away from what the opportunity aspect of what COVID and quarantine brought to us. And so because we are a Western culture who likes to know the why and explain to me why this is going to help me to take a break, just briefly, short list of benefits to resting: improved mood balance, stronger immune system, better weight control, and optimized brain function. So there's a whole lot more than that, but just to kind of put it in a nutshell, if that doesn't convince us to take a break and to pause, I don't know what would, right? But I'm less concerned with what we can measure and more concerned with the empirical evidence of what Mother Nature has to show us and teach us when we observe her rhythms. And the fact is that we can't do certain things. We can't hit the books to learn certain things. We can't perform certain things. Certain things have to wash over us. And for the washing over us to happen, we have to take a break. We have to be still and quiet. I know for myself, that's when the really massive downloads come in for my life, is when I'm quiet and take a pause. So that's where these deep mysteries lie. And John, you hit on this a little bit in your segment, how there's a feminine aspect to all of this uncontainable, amorphic, sort of intangible part of life and part of ourselves. This part of our nature is just as important as all the parts we can see and touch and measure. But because we can't see it, touch it, measure it, we tend to ignore it or push it to the side or think of it as less important because of the world we live in, which is like produce or die, make sense of the space you take up on this planet or get off of it. So we really have, it's very real, and just want to validate for people who have a difficult time taking a break, you are coming up against resistance there. So it takes a really strong commitment to this break. But why are we talking about it now? We just talked in June about the heat of summer and the vigor of that. So why all of a sudden are we talking about taking a break? Well, it's because of this Taiji symbol that you're looking at. What you see on the face of it is two sort of paisley shapes snuggled up next to each other, and each one has a speck of it, the opposite's color. And what we dualistic humans see are two different things side by side. But what it is this is one thing. These two sides are each other. They're absolutely one and the same. However, they have a multitude of expressions within that sameness. The white side represents the time of year that we're in. Because life likes to present in fractals, we can think of it like this. The biggest part of the white paisley could be high noon. It could be the summer when we're thinking about the 4 seasons. And like we said in our last segment, it could be considered the first half of life. But in that most high noon section of the white paisley, you see that black spot. That is there because it absolutely very much contains its opposite: winter, coolness, quietness. So what it's asking us to do, what Mother Nature, what this diagram is showing us, is that we don't need to go into full winter, but we do need to draw from winter a little bit. And so that can look like taking a vacation, right? It could look like taking a sabbatical, and a really big ask there, right? But wouldn't that be amazing? It could look like a plunge in a cool pool in the middle of the heat of the day. I would say that, just even to organize my thoughts, prepare my thoughts for what I'm saying now, I needed to take a break. I needed to not do anything. I mean, the most that I did was I took a walk and I sat in silence and meditated to try to allow something to come in, to wash in. So there is something really deeply powerful and meaningful that that comes from this quiet, that is not separate from the vigor of life, the action and the doing of life, the learning of life. But this informs that. This, allowing for this, makes that all the more rich. So let's open it up to the group and talk about possibly ways in our own lives. Maybe y'all have some examples of times in your life where you took a pause and something really magical or powerful came to you as a result of that.
I think in a way, any form of therapy is a pause, whether it's psychotherapy or going to an acupuncture appointment or whatever. We do have to put our life on pause. And now that people are going back to the office, and it isn't even as easy as necessarily just getting on Zoom, we have to stop these activities and devote some time to let something come up. So I think all forms of therapy are exactly what you're talking about.
I think what I've seen in my clients is like, hey, I want to do this, I want to do that, I want to like do 20 different things, and I'm like, whoa, have you scheduled or wedged in time to just take a break? They're like, oh, I don't need a break. I can just like keep going, keep doing, and then when they go to bed at night, they feel restless. they're like, I can't go to sleep. I don't know what to do. How do I? And they're like, I'm awake at like 2 a.m. in the morning. And I'm like, as much as we want to like keep going throughout the day, and you know, with summer and heat and all of these components, it's like we want to be awake, we want to have fun, we want to do all of these things, but also I tell them, you know, we kind of need to let boredom or just specific times to kind of happen, because when we overschedule or over exert ourselves, that's why we have a hard time scheduling time to rest, to develop a ritual, to just make time to kind of reflect on our mind and our body well-being. So it's super important to just kind of prioritize that when we have those moments.
And they're so highly rewarded by all the doing.
Mm-hmm.
And nobody, almost nobody, right? It's almost difficult even in a well-supported person's life to find somebody who will say, oh, I'm so glad I didn't hear from you for
Right.
2 days, that you didn't, you know, produce X, Y, and Z, that you didn't do whatever.
Yeah. And I think that's something that society has dictated, I guess, over the course of decades, is like we work hard so we can kind of provide for our family, which is understood. But, you know, now that mental health, I think, has become such a great, you know, big, I guess, I don't even know how to quantify it, but now that everyone kind of wants to work on their mind and body, I'm glad that there are new narratives for this, so that people are aware of, hey, you know, we need to just take a break.
I mean, even as someone who prescribes it, I have a challenge myself.
For me, you'd think that I'm mindfulness. I teach mindfulness, and you'd think that I'd be really good at that, but I'm terrible. It's like, that's why I need the mindfulness, is because otherwise I will just run and run and run and run until the machine just falls apart, you know? Like, I think we all know that, or know the feeling of just going and going and going until you just can't go anymore. And then the machine just stops, which I think you're right. All y'all are right. It's like, there's a stigma against, I mean, we talked about this before, but there's a stigma against depressed, right? If you go into the doctor's office and you say, I'm anxious, like I actually felt like this in the doctor's office the other day. I was, you know, telling him I'm like a little struggling, and he was like, oh, anxious. And I was like, I didn't say anxious at all in any way, really. But I think that he knew somehow that like I would be able to stomach anxious better than if he had said like, you're depressed or something, right? I think that he knew psychologically it's going to be easier to swallow if you say anxious, because anxious, like I think John talked about this at some point, anxious is like, oh, because you're so productive, right? Because you have so much on your plate. That's a good thing, right? But depressed, oh, that's low energy. That's not that productive. We don't like that much. And I'm thinking about that for myself and retreat, you know, just actually taking time, even though it's scheduled, even though it is like formatted and structured. The bounds of the retreat are saying like, I'm investing in this time just for me, right? Like, now, not my question now is like, okay, Ariel, what do you do with the unstructured time? And are you just filling up the structured time and just being a good little boy and working hard during the structured time in the retreat? It's another question. But the retreat on its own does some medicine with, even if you treat it that way, which is interesting. But I think retreats are really like that. I think seasonal, quarterly retreats are so critical for ongoing care. Quarterly is actually a great way to plan it. That way you don't miss it, you know, and if you miss it, at least you're going to get, you know, not more than half a year of distance between times. So.
Yeah, Ariel, you said something important in there, that we even will attempt to structure our unstructured time. You know, it's so uncomfortable to just sit in the sea of vastness and darkness and quiet and wait and let something come up, let something wash over us, or maybe nothing happens. Oh God, how terrifying. Right.
So let me read a book, right? Oh, we're reading now. No, now we're at the beach for the next half hour. So we're going to be at the beach for the next half hour, right? It's like, even in the being, we're like, for X long. You know, we kind of want to put parameters around things.
There's this fella, Peter Kingsley, who wrote a book called In the Dark Places of Wisdom. And he borrows from Parmenides, who was in the 5th or 6th century BC. He was a religious fella who wrote about hesuchia. It's a Greek term that means stillness. And one of the most powerful spiritual practices that a lot of these initiates would do is called incubate. And incubation is when you go into a cave and you've fasted and you've prepared a lot. You don't just do this. And this is what's crazy. You need preparation to do this. You need like specialized training to do this. And what you do is you go into a cave for 3 days and do nothing. You sit in total darkness for 3 days, at least. And I imagine that's like psychotic inducing. I mean, you're going to experience a whole lot. And so one of the things that they taught is the kind of journey Persephone took to the underworld. And there are these various stages. Tibetans teach this too. There are stages that you go through. And so there's at least a training where you can, in your disoriented state, you can kind of prepare and understand the kinds of really overwhelming intrapsychic and somewhat psychotic images and affects that you will experience. And so stillness, you might be still, you might be still, but inside it is a journey to hell. I mean, it is the underworld. And our concept of the underworld is really shallow. These are folks that actually did journey to the underworld. And the idea of dying before you die was part of the spiritual ethic. And we don't do that. What we do is we imagine after we die, we're on one tradition, we imagine that we're in some kind of golden, shiny, happy, joyful place. And there are all kinds of ideas that we have of the afterlife. And I'm not criticizing any of those. Although what I am saying is that oftentimes what we do imagine in the afterlife is part of what we imagine will help us in this life. It's an anxiety reducer. And if we had a practice of, I think Layla Scott, this is really powerful. You know, if we had a practice of stillness, it's pretty active. You know, because even when you were saying, like, if you're still and nothing is happening, something's happening. I mean, that's anxiety producing unless you've gone through you've been initiated into this training. So I really appreciate this this part of the talk and talking about stillness.
I loved what you said about the stillness being chaotic,
Yeah.
you know, in terms of internally, even though it's like, I think that's why so many of us don't want to slow down.
Totally.
I mean, I'll say that for myself, even. Like, I don't want to slow down my chaotic, like, life goings on, because internally, if I stop, I notice that there's also some crazy chaos, right? So, like, it's not that I get to avoid it. And I think that's what people who go to retreat will tell you, is that it's not like restful retreat respite. It's like work, right? It's chaotic, it's excitement, it's a lot of energy, it's psychic energy. And you may leave the retreat having shifted, right? He may, like, I was thinking about this before, is like my retreat experiences, to speak to your point, Leo Scott, have been alchemical. They have, once I've been able to just sit, or force myself to sit, or be in the container where everybody else is doing it too, and now we're all going to do it together, right? It's like, it forces the alchemy. It's like, I have to take the fire that's in me and, like, address whatever that earth energy is that's coming in, and eat the snake, right? It's like, if I'm willing, and if I'm skilled enough, right, and I want to do that, and I can show up, and with a good guidance, then I can come out the other end totally different than when I started. And then there's the integration phase, right, with like the king and that image was so cool, because like there's one thing happening here, but then, you know, I still feel today that I'm unpacking 10-year-old retreat insight.
All of that heat and chaos that we project out into our busy day-to-day lives and onto the relationships we have outside ourselves. It can be, I mean, it's the only way to go as far as I'm concerned, but it can be terrifying and too much for certain individuals, right? To be like, actually, this is my internal chaos. This is my own relationship with myself. And to bring that heat inside instead of diffuse it out is really, really intense. Really intense. And I was having this daydream really while you were talking about how retreat is work, you know, whether that's an hour of your day or a week of your life, quarterly or whatever. I was imagining, you know, saying to somebody, you know, like, I need to go on retreat. And them going, oh, wow, that is hard work. Happy to support you in whatever way that I can to make that happen. You know, like for the response to not be, ooh, how luxurious. That would be so
Right.
nice. Wish I
So
could go.
relaxing. Sounds relaxing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
You're like,
But
you've never been on retreat if you said that.
right. Right. But instead, wow, that's intense. Thank you for what you're doing. So I want to say to everybody, thank you for what you're doing. You know, those of you who do take breaks and bring the heat inside and let it burn. All right, everybody, this was our July Get Centered on taking a break. Take a break. Let us know if you need support with what comes up as a result of taking that pause. And please do subscribe, like, share these episodes if you enjoy them. And we're so grateful you're here.